Proclamation of London by Francis Barker Yockey. Section 1. The Historical Foundations of the Liberation Front. Number 1. The Unity of the Western Culture. From the beginning, the Western culture has been a spiritual unit. This basic, universally formative fact is in the sharpest contrast to the shallow and ignorant outlook of those who pretend that the unity of the West is a new idea, a technical thing which can only be brought about on a limited and conditional basis. From its very birthcry in the Crusades, the Western culture had one state, with the emperor at its head, one church and religion, Gothic Christianity, with an authoritarian pope, one race, one nation, and one people, which felt itself and was recognized by all outer forces to be distinct and unitary. There was a universal style, Gothic, which inspired and informed all art from the crafts to the cathedrals. There was one ethical code for the culture-bearing stratum, Western chivalry, founded on a purely Western feeling of honor. There was a universal language, Latin, and a universal law, Roman law. Even in the very adoption of older, non-Western things, the West was unitary. It made such things into an expression of its proper soul, and it universalized them. More important than anything else, this culture felt itself to be a power unit as against all outer forces, whether barbarians like the Slavs, Turks, and Mongols, or civilized like the Moors, Jews, and Saracens. Embryonic national differences existed even then within the West, but these differences were not felt as contrasts, and could not possibly become at that time the focus of a struggle for power. A Western knight was fighting equally for his fatherland, whether in battle against the Slav or the Turk on the eastern marches of Germany, against the Moor in Spain, Italy, or Sicily, or against the Saracen in the Levant. The outer forces recognized as well this inner unity of the West. To Islam, all Westerners, whatever, were lumped together as Franks, Giaours. This higher cultural unity embraced within its rich possibilities the several nation ideas which were to actualize so much of Western history, for it is obviously a part of the divine plan that a high culture create as phases of its own unfolding not only higher aesthetic units, schools of music, painting, and lyric higher religious and philosophical units, schools of mysticism and theology, higher bodies of nature knowledge, schools of techniques and scientific research, but also higher power units within itself. Emperor versus papacy, states versus emperor and pope, front versus king, nation versus nation. In Gothic times, the intracultural power struggle between emperor and pope was always strictly subordinated by the universal conscience to the outer tension with the non-member of the culture, the barbarian and the heathen. The nations existed then, but not as power units, not as political organisms. The members of the nations felt themselves to be different from one another, but the differences were in no case determining of the whole orientation to life. A Slavic, Turkish, or Moorish attack on Europe was met by forces drawn from all parts of Europe. The first political expression of Europe was in the Crusades, in which Europe was a power unit acting against the outer world in unitary self-assertion of its newborn soul. Alongside of this form of politics there arose the tension which endured for 3 centuries within the culture of the twin factions of emperor and pope, and then from the middle of the 13th century began the revolt of the great barons and bishops against the absolute power of emperor and pope. This was a step further away from the prime cultural unity, but it in no way affected the great essential idea of unity of the West vis-a-vis any extra-cultural force. Thus, during this period the Pope decreed that the crossbow was a barbarous weapon and forbade its use against members of Western Christendom, but expressly sanctioned its use against barbarians and heathens. The increasing political differentiation within the culture was simply the organic process of fulfilling the manifold possibilities of the soul of the Western culture. The entire process was organically necessary, and thus divinely necessary, for the soul of a high culture is a direct emanation of the Godhead. The development continued with the breaking of the religious unity of the West, in Renaissance, Reformation, and Counter-Reformation. These phenomena, religious in origin, show us the true meaning of the political. Whenever any superpersonal movement or idea rises to the intensity at which it involves the question of life or death, it therewith becomes political. regardless of its origin in a non-political sphere. From that moment, the contestants are states, political organisms, regardless of how they describe themselves, and the way of conducting the organism is the political way, dividing the world into friend and enemy, seeking after power and not after truth, pursuing alliance, war, and negotiation and not conversion and salvation. This is the lesson of the Reformation centuries, as it had been of the centuries of the papal imperial conflict. Accompanying the breakdown of religious unity, which transformed itself into a political struggle, was the rise of the dynastic state, and the beginning of large-scale intercultural wars among Western states. Again, this unifying process within the culture was limited. The intra-European wars which took place were conditioned entirely by the great fact, felt and understood by all, that the European states belonged to the same cultural world. Thus, these wars never proceeded to the political annihilation of the opponent. They were prosecuted only to the point where the limited issue which had occasioned the war could become the object of negotiations which could satisfy both contestants. The handing over of a strip of territory or the recognition of an inheritance, such were the limited issues of these intercultural wars. The scale of these dynastic wars gradually increased, until the dynastic form of politics was itself finished towards the close of the 18th century, when a new form of intracultural power struggle emerged. But during the centuries of dynastic politics, with its limited wars and its conquest preservation of cultural unity, the other type of politics, with its other form of war, went on between Western political units and outer forces, absolute politics. These wars were unconditioned by the fact of mutual membership in a high culture, and the presence of a common code of honor, for the barbarian and the heathen did not share the feeling of Western chivalrous obligations. The Hussite Wars, 1420–1436, show the nature of warfare between a cultured people and a barbarian people. For 16 years, the Hussite army flooded over large areas of Germany, burning, ravaging, killing, and destroying. This nihilistic Slavic outburst was totally unconnected with any constructive war aim, and was thus merely an early expression of what is now called Bolshevism, the spirit of negation and destruction wherever it manifests itself, which aims at the outer annihilation of everything Western. During the centuries of Gothic and Baroque, it was primarily Germany and Spain which protected the body of the West and saved it from the barbarian horrors which had been its fate if the outer forces had prevailed.